Let's resume. Mr. Costello.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Admiral, you answered a question earlier posed to you by my colleague Lamar Smith, and I'd like to follow up on that. On pages 116 through 118 and later in your report, you refer to the schedule pressure, the pressure that was put on NASA employees by the schedule that was adopted by the administrator. And I'd like to ask a few questions concerning the pressures that may have been added because of the schedule. And one is, you apparently, according to your report, the board's report, you very carefully evaluated the impact that the schedule pressure may have had on shuttle safety. And specifically, the administrator seems to have laid out a management goal of completing Nod 2 of the International Space Station by February 1904. And my impression is, from reading the report, is that most of the NASA program people believe that that was an unrealistic goal. They also believe that if they didn't meet these arbitrary goals, that something bad was going to happen to them. And I wonder if you might comment what you found regarding the schedule pressure and how that impacted safety.
We did find that schedule pressure, undue schedule pressure, excessive schedule pressure was at work on the workforce in NASA, even though, as I indicated in my previous answer, the senior management will deny that, but we did find it present in the workforce. And as the illustrations in our report indicate, we also were concerned that some of the measures that NASA was taking to stay on schedule appear to be cutting into the safety margin. Such things as working on weekends, conducting safety checks in parallel instead of series. They're all listed in those charts in there. They all appear to be they all appear to support our basic hypothesis that bad traits and bad engineering habits had crept into the NASA organization. We don't say in our report, and I don't think the board feels, that schedule pressure caused this accident. That's not what we're suggesting.
You talk repeatedly in the report about the communication failures at NASA concerning the Columbia disaster, and you know it's surprising to me that the administrator and top management never seemed to hear from the people in the program level that the schedule, the core complete goal, needed to be adjusted or changed. Did you find any evidence at all of discussions that may have taken place concerning the goal complete, core complete goal among the top managers, or any consideration of how it impacted safety of the shuttle? I know the top management said that they never heard, but in your investigation, did...
Yes. I'll let General Hess answer that. He's the expert on that area.
Thanks. I think in our investigation of it, and it's documented in some of the charts and report, we know that the International Space Station managers as well as the shuttle managers were briefing the number of days of slack in the schedule, and the briefing charts were in the last venue, I think, in December of 2002, indicated to the leadership that they were projecting as much as a 45-day late. Last line on the chart says, but we're going to hold to the February date. And so I think that the discussion was there, that they were telling the NASA leadership that their best estimates were that they were going to be behind, but they were still sticking to the date. Now, how far the conversations went beyond the briefing chart, I don't think we know. But when we get back and look at the circumstantial evidence, how it unfolded with regards to decisions made on STS-113 and then on-orbit decisions that were made with this particular mishap, it looks like it all came together to influence decisions.
General, a follow-up question, if I can. Do you have any concerns that the return to flight goal laid out by the administrator may produce some of the same pressures that Nod 2 did?
Well, obviously, I'd have concerns if NASA doesn't have a realistic timeline decided. I think that perhaps giving them some credit here, the initial estimates about when they wanted to return to fly were done before the full value of the report was laid out before them, so they could actually see the recommendations and how long it was going to take them to get from where they are currently to actually the return to flight decision. And certainly some of the key return to flight recommendations will establish a timeline that may not have been apparent when the schedule is set. So I think that they have every opportunity to fix a schedule that will be realistic.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you, Admiral, before I go to Mr. Calvert. NASA has indicated the return to flight report will be out next Monday, I think, the 8th or Tuesday. Will you be in a position to give us sort of an instant evaluation of that plan?
Obviously, I'm going to retain a small staff because we have more work to do, and we are at your disposal to do whatever you want to do. I would say that Mr. O'Keefe indicated in testimony yesterday that the return to flight schedule is events-driven, not calendar-driven. So he said we return to flight when we're ready, not on a date.
And you're due to be testifying for the committee with Mr. O'Keefe on the 10th.
That's correct.
And so I'm sure you'll have some choice words on that. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing and the hearings we're going to have in the future. And I want to thank Admiral Gaiman and certainly the Investigation Board for all their hard work, and we certainly appreciate that. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the issue that was brought up during your testimony, Admiral, and that's the role of independence. I'm interested in learning more about the board's suggestion that responsibility and authority for decisions involving technical requirements and safety should rest with an independent technical authority. And I agree with you. I agree with the conclusion and the relating recommendation. NASA needs to utilize independent assessment capabilities that will serve them throughout the life cycle of the space system and human space generally. And as you know, Admiral, in your career in the United States Navy, some of the oldest and best independent assessment work came from the Navy's painful experience in World War II with torpedo fuses, which was well documented, and the Navy learned their lessons and created some of it, which is in my district, NAVC Corona, which I represent, which traces back to that original problem. Within your recommendation that NASA stand up on an independent assessment capability, is there room, encouragement, direction for NASA to use that kind of experience and to follow agencies like DOD to establish that authority?
Thank you for the question, and the answer is that the answer to that question gets right to the core of our recommendation. We tried to devise a practical, workable recommendation that would fix as many of the problems at one time as we possibly could. And the traits and the unhappy characteristics that we saw in the ignoring of engineering advice, the email story about the images, many of these ills, we thought could be fixed with one management fix. And that management fix is to take the ownership of the Level 1 specifications and requirements and all waivers to them, and the chairman had mentioned how many 3,000 some odd waivers we're flying with right now, invest them in a technical engineering organization which is divorced, isolated from cost and schedule pressure. And this is done other places. We found other places where it's done. You mentioned NAVC Corona, which does not only now it does missile, it does all kinds of analysis of weapons effectiveness, and they are completely independent from the guy who has to shell the money out. And so you get an independent assessment. We find that to be a very attractive methodology for fixing a number of problems.
And when you say independent of NASA, would they have a separate budget? Would NASA still control their budget? Would you kind of expand on how that organization will work and and the relationship with the shuttle program manager? It
is not our intent that they be independent from NASA. It is our intent that they be independent from the shuttle program. They would still be within NASA as we viewed it. We were very careful in our report, and we discussed among ourselves at great length the issue of not specifying in any great detail how this organization should be set up. Since we're not going to be around to micromanage it or be around to make the fine-tuning that are necessary to any management change, we decided instead to specify with great detail and great directness how this organization should work, what its function should be, but not draw the wiring diagram. So this organization would be within NASA, but it would be independent of the shuttle program.
Understand. Dr. Hollick, General Hess, Dr. Winall, any other comments on that, on the Independence Technical Board?
Yes, I might make a comment. I think this, as the Admiral has indicated, is an extremely important recommendation. And from my way of thinking, what we have given NASA is a template, or as a scientist, I might say we've given them a set of boundary conditions. I believe very strongly that it is in the working out that will take place within the agency of how this will work, what processes will be used, how the interaction and interfaces between the shuttle program and the independent technical agency, how that will all work, I believe will go a long way towards challenging the basic culture of NASA, because it will challenge some of their basic assumptions about, you know, what is true, what is fact, what is analysis, how do you make decisions. So I look to it to have a really good effect on the agency, the working out of the details within the template.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Admiral Gaiman, I want to join with my colleagues who've passed commendations on to you and the other board members and your staff for the work that you've done on this report. I, too, remember back when, I guess in February, when Administrator O'Keefe said we may never know the answer. I think that we can feel confident that you've indeed determined the physical cause of this accident. I read your report to say that NASA must see significant reform, the agency must develop a vision for the future, and that the administration and Congress must provide NASA with adequate funding levels. And I see that as a new mantra for us. Let's do what my senator said yesterday when she said, let's throw out faster, better, cheaper in the garbage can. Let's start looking at reform, vision, and funding, and perhaps we can have some different successes. It seems clear from your report in the area of reform that NASA and the space community are comprised of an enormously talented and dedicated group of men and women who are capable of making the cultural changes that your report indicates. How specifically do we continue to support their important efforts as NASA continues the return to flight process and institutionalizes the changes that will support sustained, safe operations over the long run?
That's a tall question, Mr. Lamson, but I'll give you a couple of answers to that. First of all, it isn't NASA that needs a vision; it's the country that needs a vision. NASA's got lots of visions, but visions without resources are just dreams. We need an agreed vision. And then NASA can execute that. The reforms that we call for in our report cannot be instituted by the administrator of NASA alone. He's going to have your help. For example, this independent technical review authority that we just discussed will have a manpower bill associated with it. These are people that are going to have to be hired, and they're going to have to be paid. They're going to have career paths, et cetera, et cetera. So the administrator is going to have to come up here and get your assistance on this. Some of the other reforms are going to require your assistance too, because they are not solely within the purview of the administrator of NASA. The funding business, the board, in order that we weren't affected by cost and funding, we kind of isolated ourselves from costs, and we don't know exactly what it's going to cost to return to flight. I would say that our experience of working this problem for just under 7 months indicates that none of the things we've recommended are terrifically expensive. I mean, they aren't showstoppers. But some of the things that we recommended for the midterm, for example, is completely independent new technical review authority, an independent safety organization with line authority over safety means more people, more government people, and some of the other recommendations having to do with the oversight of the SFOC contract means more government employees. So he's going to have to come up here and explain to you how he's going to go about it, and you're going to have to help him.
You made the comment about vision, and in the report you also said lack of agreed national vision for human spaceflight. Would you expand on that finding for just a few seconds, please?
Well, we attempted to find everything that we possibly could that contributed to bad habits and bad traits and bad management at NASA, and there were a lot of things that contributed a little tiny bit, and some things that contributed largely. This was a contributor. But for lack of an agreed national vision, you don't know how many years to amortize investment in infrastructure. It's hard to argue budgets before Congress if you don't have an agreed vision to where you're going. You don't know when to replace equipment. We saw in some of their technical laboratories 1960 era oscilloscopes and things like that, analog meters when everybody's using digital meters, and there are basic infrastructure decisions and basic investment decisions which NASA has a hard time arguing or justifying because we don't have a complete agreement on how long is the shuttle going to be around, what's it going to be used for in the future, and so it's very difficult for them to make investment kinds of choices.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask, and I'm not going to because my time is about to run out, I would like to ask at some point in time for your advice on the board's advice on how to recognize in the future when a lack of resources has pushed the program into an unsafe condition. And that might be something that you may want to think about and at a future opportunity we'll have. But let me take my last couple of seconds and close, if I may. I do believe that we should give NASA the funding that it needs. But first, the agency must make necessary reforms and establish a vision. Your report calls on the White House and on Congress and NASA to honor the memory of Columbia's crew by reflecting on the nation's future in space. And I couldn't agree more. And now that your report has been released, this administration must provide Congress and the American people with a vision and a concrete set of goals for the nation's human spaceflight program after the International Space Station. And I'm hopeful that the agency will establish a phased series of goals over the next 20 years, including human visits to the Earth-Sun libration points, Earth orbit crossing asteroids, as we've been reading about, deployment of a human-tended research and habitation facility on the moon, and human expeditions to the surface of and moons of Mars. And I attempted to push such legislation, push NASA into the direction of my Space Exploration Act legislation that I introduced in the last Congress. I'm going to do that again, Mr. Chairman, next week. And I invite all of our colleagues on this panel to please take a look, please make advice or suggestions to me as to how to make it the kind of legislation that would fit into our discussion today. And again, I thank you, Admiral Gaiman. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamson. I would note a particular passage in the report on page 209. NASA has usually failed to receive budgetary support consistent with its ambitions. I would suggest that probably that would apply to any agency of the federal government. And I'm glad we're focusing so much attention on vision, because we have to have a shared vision. It has to be the executive branch and the legislative branch, and we and the American people signing on to that vision. But further on, I would report on page 105 of the report, we're talking about budget reductions. We're all part of this process, but let me just read a couple of things here. Reductions have been requested by NASA during the final stages of budget deliberations. After its budget was passed by Congress, NASA further reduced the shuttle budget in the agency's operating plan, the plan by which NASA actually allocates its appropriated budget during the fiscal year to react to changing program needs. These released funds were allocated to other activities both within the human spaceflight program and in other parts of the agency. And then it goes on to enumerate all the changes that were made. Of course, we haven't provided NASA or any other agency with every dollar they've requested, and we have to be very mindful of our special responsibilities. But when it's pointed out that we don't provide the budget to consistent with an agency's ambitions, I would suggest that the agency better adjust its ambitions, and we better sign on to what we agree on is the vision for a program for the rest of the budget year and beyond. With that, I go to Mr. Gutnick, the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And again, I thank all of you for what you've done, and I think your answers today have been very candid, and we appreciate that more than you can imagine. Yesterday, the administrator, Mr. O'Keefe, testified before the Senate Commerce Committee, and he indicated unequivocally that he understood the message and would implement the recommendations of your report. But, you know, success leaves clues, and good management requires setting benchmarks and finding, you know, as we go forward, how are we doing in terms of implementing that? And if you were sitting on this side of these desks, what would you look for in terms of benchmarks so that we could actually have a better confidence that they really are implementing the plan, at least as you outline it in your report? Any particular things we should look for in the next 6 months I'll mention a couple things, and I think I'm going to ask Dr. Woodnall, who has some comments about oversight and review and things like that. First and foremost, of course, is the Stafford-Covey. The first and foremost is the waiting for the NASA return to flight plan. We have to get it, and we have to look at it. The second of all, I think very prudently, we have a very illustrious, large panel, the Stafford-Covey Return to Flight Review Group, which is going to provide an opinion and evaluation, not of our report, but they're going to provide an evaluation of the adequacy of NASA's response to it. And kind of like the guy Stever panel did for the solid rocket booster joint review, I think that's a very, very good step. But the real core of our recommendations are recommendations which need to be implemented a year from now, 2 years from now, and 3 years from now. And I think that the question remains open in my mind as to how to follow up on that effectively. And setting benchmarks is a good way to do it. There are other ways to do it. And I think that Dr. Woodnall wanted to make a comment about the efficacy of some kind of a review panel, which might measure those things. So if you allow me, I'll recognize Dr. Woodnall.
Please.
Okay, well, let me make a couple of remarks. First of all, I do believe that our recommendation that in the return to flight, NASA should come forward with a plan on reorganization was actually inspired. It's one of those things that happens when a group of people get together and, you know, talk deeply about an issue. And I think it really was an inspired idea. From my point of view, the organization that we have recommended, the Independent Technical Authority and the Safety Organization, have specific attributes, and you could almost check them off. We leave it to NASA to do the details, figure out where in the organization it houses, who it reports to, and all of that. But the process is the fact of its independence is a specific attribute that can be measured, and there's no fudging up of that. So I think that's identifiable. As to the issue of oversight, I think there has been a tendency to simply recommend an oversight committee. I think there's a big difference between oversight inside an organization and oversight outside of an organization. I've not been a fan of standing outside oversight committees because I think with time they tend to atrophy. They lose, you know, the urgency. They have an initial charter, they have an initial mission, and they set out on that mission, but then over time it kind of dwindles away. So I am concerned about establishing yet another, quote, outside advisory committee. I'm much more in favor of what I would call the sense of urgency, short-time committee, such as we ourselves were. We were a short-time committee, 7 months. We had a sense of urgency about what we were doing. We were willing to work real hard for a short period of time. So those are some of the trade-offs that you might think about as you look into the issue of how can you get adequate oversight for some of the details that need to be followed up on. I do believe that safety is a technical discipline, so you will need comments from people who basically are safety disciplinarians and people who've had experience at these kind of very intense investigations, such as our board. But the question of follow-on oversight is a challenging question, and I know that you'll be giving a great deal of thought to this as you proceed.
And speaking of urgency, and I know we all have to run and vote, but I couldn't let you go without at least mentioning, and perhaps you can respond briefly. Homer Hickam wrote a fairly blunt piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day, and he titled the piece NASA's Vietnam. And in it he says, and if I could just read this in the record, he says, take a look at the shuttle stack and see what you see. A fragile space plane sitting on the back of a huge propellant tank between two massive solid rocket boosters. The shuttle has to sit right in the middle of all of this turmoil of launch because we once believed that it would be cheaper to bring back those engines and rebuild them rather than to build new ones. That has proved not to be the case, far from it. But it has left the crew sitting in the most vulnerable position possible in terms of design. Would any of you like to talk about that? Because essentially what he says is that the whole design is a flawed strategy, and that we have to get serious about coming up with a whole new way of launching a returnable vehicle. Anybody like to comment? And I apologize because our time is short. We don't have enough time to discuss it in length. But
we felt so strongly about this that we devoted the whole first chapter in our report to the issue of the compromises that were made when they built this thing. And because we felt that the compromises, the original design compromises, left us with what we got. I mean, it's what we got is what we got, and it's a compromised vehicle. Now, it's an engineering marvel, but I know as an aerodynamicist and Dr. Halleck also as a physicist, we'll constantly scratch our head as to why you have three 400,000 horsepower engines on a glider. And why do you put them into orbit? And we know the answer. I mean, we know the answer, but in retrospect, it's an interesting question. But to make a long story short, we agree with you, and that's why we devoted a whole chapter to the issue of the design compromises that were originally made when this shuttle was originally built.
And that's why you essentially recommend that as soon as possible this vehicle be replaced.
Thank you. Gentlemen's time has expired now. We have another vote, but we'll dash over, and I promise you faithfully we'll dash right back. And Mr. Wu will be first up. We'll see who dashes the fastest.
Thank you. No, he basically says we have no choice but to use them. We can't shut that thing down. We need to shut off the space station. In other words, he talks about, we have to run about 10 more missions, but we don't have any choice.
And I understand when Mr. Gutnick gets back, Dr. Widnall, you wanted to give some supplementary remarks in response to his question. So while we're waiting for the others to get back, let me bring up a subject that you might not want me to bring up. But Admiral Gaiman, you indicated that you're not going to be micromanaging and fine-tuning everything. But we do need, and we've got our special oversight responsibilities. We have to be vigorous with them, and I can assure you we will be. And I understand, Dr. Widnall, you said about all these external panels, appointing new panels. You're not quite certain they always do the job that they intend to do. But at the risk of offending you, this is a compliment to you. We need some help in evaluating the plan. And would the panel be receptive to sort of a one-year review? Now, I don't know how practical that is. Because you're constituted under the authority of NASA. Maybe we could be reconstituted under the authority of the Congress, but I think you provided invaluable service to the nation. You have expertise. You've brought an awful lot to the table for us to consume and digest, and I would like some help in the process. And I'm wondering if you would be receptive to sort of a one-year look back, an evaluation. Not micromanaging, not fine-tuning, evaluating how NASA has responded to what you have proposed, what the administrator says he embraces, which we are applauding. Admiral, would you care to comment on that?
Yes, sir. I consulted my colleagues about that, and I'm authorized to say on their behalf that if it's requested by the Congress, we would do that.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that, and I can almost assure you that it will be requested by the Congress. Now, if Mr. Gutnick back, but Dr. Widnall, did you wish to offer some supplementary comments for the record?
Let me make two. Let me second what Admiral Gaiman said, and I see it, one of its virtues as providing some continuity, and in some sense that's a force multiplier for the time that we all put in on this. And so I think it actually gratifies us because we will feel that our work is even more effective if we do provide this kind of continuity. So it's certainly something that I welcome.
I've been in Congress 21 years. I started out at the lowest level in the first tier as a junior member. And over these years, I've seen a lot of reports. They're issued. They're produced by dedicated Americans who bring special expertise to the table. And more often than not, they gather dust on the shelf. The Rogers report, there was immediacy in responding to some of the recommendations. Then the atrophy set in, as you've referred to. We're going to follow through on this thing. We've got to be vigorous. And we just can't look to NASA and say, all right, now the problem's been identified. You know how to fix it? Fix it. We've got to be part of the solution. And so we have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, are we as vigorous as we should be in connection with our oversight responsibilities? And so if Mr. Wu is not back yet, we'll go.
Well, the second point I wanted to make, which was really the point that you called on me for, was just as we finished the last round of questions, was really just to point out the timescales involved in these sorts of endeavors in the space field. I mean, when you talk about let's find a replacement shuttle, you're talking 10 years. You're talking a very high level of technology. It also goes back to the issue that I discussed with Mr. Hall. What is the word consider? The word consider means to do an in-depth engineering analysis of what are the possibilities, what are the trade-offs, what are the options. And that certainly is a process that needs to go forward as we think about replacing the shuttle, new concepts for manned space vehicles, how do we service the space station. All of these things require an in-depth engineering analysis, and the timescale involved is certainly measured in years, certainly up to 10 years before one would have a new generation of vehicles. So that was really the only point I wanted to make.
Thank you very much, and I see our distinguished colleague, Mr. Wu, is back. Mr. Wu is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Gaiman, always good to see you, members of your board, although one always wishes under other circumstances. Like others, I want to commend you for finding the physical cause of this tragedy at the RCC Panel 8, and also for identifying some of the organizational and one might say cultural factors in NASA that have contributed to this set of tragedies. I want to encourage the panel here to look forward a bit and focus on something related to the cultural and organizational issues that you identified, but not exactly those. And that is the recruitment and retention of the best and brightest, especially young people, but people of all ages. In my experience, as I've gotten older, everybody else has gotten younger in various organizations. My teachers have gotten a lot younger in my eyes. As I visited NASA sites, and this is with great respect to NASA personnel, they seem older than I remember them when I saw them on television when I was a young person watching the Apollo program and the Gemini program and so on. And I know older folks, whether it's at NASA or on the board or in Congress, can make great contributions. But back in the 1960s, there were, you know, NASA was, especially as chairman of various committees. There were a few places to go, and NASA was probably the place to go if you were really into technology and really hot to go. It was not only technologically and scientifically the most exciting place to go, but it was also part of this competition with the Soviet Union that made it a part of our national purpose. You know, today the Cold War is over. We were the first to the moon. And in addition to that, we have all these private companies and other places where folks in technology can be drawn off to, whether it's by higher salaries or nimbleness of adeptness of movement in the organization. What are some of the things that can be done to help NASA recruit and retain people? And some of the negative factors that are there, some of the positive things that can be built in for the future. And I'd just like to engage the panel to discuss that.
Absolutely, and the panel has discussed it, and I know as an educator, Dr. Woodnall has an opinion about that, as do my other colleagues. I very briefly will say, list three things. First and foremost is a mission. And it's not a good mission, a good recognized mission which excites people will overcome low government salaries and a whole bunch of other things. The second place is you have to have a really great place to work. And that I'm talking about the work attitude, the climate at work and all that kind of stuff. And I think NASA is a good place to work. It can be made better because of some of the traits that we talked about. And the last one would be I would like to see NASA reduce the number of times that they give the top really good jobs to outsiders. NASA too often, in my mind, takes the top really best jobs and gives them and recruits outsiders rather than moving people up from within. They like to hire admirals and generals for center directors and things like that instead of taking the best NASA people and make them center directors and things like that. Even though I like admirals and generals, I really think that if you're a career NASA employee and you want to rise to the top, and then you see the top jobs going to outsiders, you have to scratch your head. As part of that, in the space flight operations contract, the SFOC, a lot of very high-level positions, which I thought ought to be government positions, are now contractor positions. And once again, these are top-level positions which have been contracted out to really competent people. But what it instills in the workforce is that you work for the government for 15 or 18 years, and then if you really want to go into the top jobs, you have to go over to the contractor side to get to the top job. I find all three of these things that could make the place a much better place to work. And as an educator and a close student of this, I know that Dr. Woodnall may want to comment on it.
Yeah, I knew this was coming. No, and as an educator, as an aerospace educator, I know that there is something about aerospace that evokes the passion of young people. There's no question about it. There is hardly any other field to which people are drawn because of the real excitement of the field. There's no question about that. As an aerospace educator, I feel that it's my responsibility to take that passion and turn it into an appreciation for responsible engineering. And I think that that's a challenge. I do think it is no longer the case that NASA is the only place to go. I mean, this committee knows more than any other committee about the broad range of science and technology that our nation is advancing. Work in the biological sciences, work in the computer sciences, in miniaturization, new materials. Science and technology are advancing across a broad front. Space is exciting, but it is not the only exciting thing that we as a nation are doing. So what I think is that we have to learn to operate in a much more complex environment where young people, in fact, do have a range of options, a range of exciting things to do. And I think we have to ensure that across a broad range of disciplines, and I think it will feed directly into our science and technological strength as a nation. Young people are excited by the development of new capabilities, and to the extent that NASA moves forward with a vision, a national vision for space, and the development of new capabilities, I think young people will naturally be drawn to NASA as a place for employment.
I have a burning follow-up question, but I know better, Mr. Chairman, than to ask if I can ask it under these circumstances. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired, and we will see if there can be a second round for burning follow-up questions. That's, and I apologize if my question is not relevant or has been answered because I've been popping in and out of 3 meetings this morning, all of which unfortunately happen to be urgent, and I apologize for that. But looking toward the future, it seems to me the very first thing that we in the Congress and, frankly, the American people have to decide is whether we want to continue human exploration of space. And I suspect the answer is yes, just because, as Dr. Widnow mentioned, there's some magic to aerospace. That this is something that we want to do. It's part of our background, our ethic, that we should be out exploring in every dimension. So, assuming the answer is yes, it seems to me that our highest priority has to be to design, develop, and build a new type of space vehicle. My first question is, do you see that, and what do you regard as the characteristics we need? It seems to me that given modern technology that has developed since the design of the space shuttle, that we can build it safer and better, more efficient, slower, less turnaround time, and higher efficiency and lower cost. And that perhaps in the long run it'll in fact save money to have in a vehicle if we can design one that satisfies those criteria. So that's the first question. And secondly, I'd appreciate just a comment from you on the balance between what one might call scientific research and what one might call human exploration. We all know that dollar for dollar we get much more science done with unmanned experiments, satellites, rovers, than we do of human exploration of space. I'm just, even though this was not your task, I'm asking for your opinion. What is the balance now, and what do you think it should be between those two? So 2 questions, and we'll start at.
Well, I'm going to ask Dr. Halleck to take a shot at the first one, sir, and then we'll rearm to take a shot at the second one.
Dr. Halleck.
When you look back at this thing that we were studying, the shuttle thing, remember it came from the 1960s and technology, and it also, as we point out, particularly in Chapter 1, when it was being put together, a lot of the requirements were actually given to people. To follow up on a question that we discussed earlier this morning, why do you put the shuttle where you do, where it can get hit by all this material that's out there? Well, the reason is that one of the key requirements that was levied upon these people back then was that you wanted to put together a system that would be reusable. So things like the big engines and everything that you put on the shuttle, in order for them to be reusable, you had to put it on something that came back. So what I'm really saying is, if I fully agree that one needs to look at trying to look to the future and come up with a design of a vehicle to get us safely into space, but not burden it with so many things that actually were compromises. And these are the things that I think that have led to all of these problems. The example of, if you look at the shuttle and look at some of the earlier designs, you put the shuttle on the top. So what's going to fall on it? Nothing. If anything, it's shedding material, as opposed to having things that could come off and hit it. So that's my point, is that you really can do it, but you need to have a clean slate. And as part of that clean slate, you can also add in those other issues, which were, what can we do to allow ways for the crew to get out in case there is a real problem? There's a number of things you can add.
So, in your opinion, do you think we can design something that meets the criteria I mentioned? Safer, less expensive, more efficient, less turnaround time?
Once again, we've got 30 years of technology now behind us at this point, and I firmly believe that you can do that, yes.
And can there be a good replacement for the tile system, which is one of the biggest factors in the slow turnaround?
Well, they even have an interim thing where they've come up with a tile that is much stronger and can withstand a lot of strikes, more so than the existing. So there are some intermediate technology types of things that can be done too, yes.
Right. And the second question?
Well, first of all, I agree with Dr. Halleck, and I would ask you to factor into your equation of the not only the next vehicle but also the robotics versus the human, the value of the human spaceflight program. That as long as the only way that we have to get outside the Earth's gravitational field, or to get into orbit, or to escape the Earth's gravitational field, is to sit on top of an enormously explosive chemical reaction, which is right now, that's the only way we know how to do it. You are flirting with a very dangerous process, and there is no getting around it, and we should not ever diminish how dangerous that is. And then when you come home, you have to take every single kilojoule of that same amount of energy, and you got to somehow dissipate it in order to slow yourself down from orbital speed. And that is also extraordinarily dangerous. You've got to figure out a way that you can re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and dissipate all that energy in the form of heat. You got to change the speed into heat, and then you got to dissipate all that heat, which puts the humans in a very dangerous situation. And we should not minimize that danger. And now the reason I gave that little lecture, if you'll forgive me, is because when you start, that's job one, is to get humans safely up there and back in.
May I just interject? That assumes a returnable vehicle. If you decide you're going to have a capsule come back and dispose of the engines.
But even if you use it in a capsule, you still have the kinetic energy problem. You got to get up there and you got to get back.
No, but you don't have as much to dispose.
That's correct. No, that's okay.
Considerably less.
Considerably less. That's right. But if you consider job one to be safely get into orbit and safely get back, then everything else that you add on to every other requirement, you're going to. And if you say you want it to be efficient and cost-effective and reusable, et cetera, you are whittling into that safety requirement. And so this board, with this experience that we've gained from this investigation, would say let us not in any way diminish the danger and the physical challenges here, and start adding additional requirements into this. Let's just get them safely into orbit and safely home. Now, the robotics for the human thing, I would offer that we didn't really do much of a study in this, but we did educate ourselves into this matter, as well as the vision thing, so that we could put our report into context. And my personal view is that every briefing I listened to, every book I read on the subject, indicates that no matter what your vision, long-range vision is for what we're going to do in interplanetary travel or stations on the moon or whatever it is, all visions, they all start in low Earth orbit. None of them start on the surface of the Earth. And therefore, we have to perfect getting into and out of low Earth orbit, no matter what the plan for the future is. That's our view. And that perfecting getting into and out of low Earth orbit is a worthy enough goal by itself.
Okay, I have to excuse myself to go vote so that the chairman's return. Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes Mr. Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Gaiman, good to see you again. I want to commend you for the report and also the way you and the committee conducted yourselves throughout the investigation. It was impressive, and I certainly respect the openness that you demonstrated both with members of this committee but also with the public throughout the process. I want to follow up on something that my colleague Mr. Wu was talking about in terms of the cultural and organizational problems that you point out in the report. The day the report came out, I had the opportunity to speak to a group of NASA employees that evening. And while there seemed to be a general acceptance, certainly an expectation that the report would be critical, the one area that they seem to feel that there will be some difficulty with that has to do with changing the culture of NASA. And in looking at the report in Chapter 7, I wanted to go over some of the statements therein and see if maybe you can expound on them so there will be a clear understanding of what we're talking about when you say changing the culture. Starting with avoiding oversimplification, and I'll just read this particular part. The Columbia accident is an unfortunate illustration of how NASA's strong cultural bias and its optimistic organizational thinking undermined effective decision-making. Over the course of 22 years, foam strikes were normalized to the point where they were simply a maintenance issue, a concern that did not threaten a mission's success. And when you read something like that, you point to a cultural bias, but was it so much a cultural problem, or was it caused by not having a system in place that would help identify that kind of problem and address it?
I think the answer to your question is basically yes in both counts. But what we're getting at is in the definition of organizational culture that we adapted is how does the organization, even absent rules, react to problem situations. In the instance of oversimplification, what we saw was an almost immediate assumption that there is not a problem. And this is a learned behavior. It took 22 years for him to learn that perhaps there's not a problem with foam coming. So when you put down one of the things that you need to avoid if you're a highly reliable organization that deals in high-risk technology is that you don't just assume that there are no problems. Start by assuming that there's a worst case and by
Admiral, did you want to comment on it as well?
No, I agree, and we thought long and hard about that particular section, and the relationship to culture. The relationship to culture is that as we carefully defined in our little blue sidebar in the front of that Chapter 7, that culture is as we used it in here in this report. Culture is how the organization acts kind of intrinsically. It's how they act outside the rules. It's how they act when their boss is not in the room. And it's how they think. And in this particular case, they have an oversimplified view of a complex issue, and they stick to that oversimplified view. They get rigid in it, and they do not realize that these are complex things in which one flaw can affect another system.
And please let me be clear. I'm not in any way critical of what is stated. I just think there needs to be a clear direction going forward so that people understand exactly what you mean when we talk about changing the culture, because I would agree there are obvious problems that need to be addressed, but they can't be addressed unless there's a clear understanding. In the paragraph above, importance of communication. Every manager knew the party line. We'll wait for the analysis. No safety of flight issue expected. In the course of the investigation and the people that you talked to, what was your understanding of how such a, quote, party line is developed?
There are a number of factors, but the one that I would point to is what I would call, what I like to characterize as an informal chain of command. That is, once the Space Shuttle program opined on something, then other people, other divisions, other agencies, even though they are technically independent, were hesitant to move against that opinion. The shuttle program,
for fear of reprisal,
for fear of reprisal, for fear of being ridiculed, but mostly the problem was that even though on paper they had a set of checks and balances, they had independent engineers and independent safety, the fact of the matter is the shuttle program over the years had become so powerful. All funding flowed from the shuttle program. All promotions go from the shuttle program. They had become so powerful that independent voices and minority opinions were not welcome. And it takes, in a complex matrix organization like the shuttle program is, it takes a very elegant communication scheme, carefully managed and carefully nurtured, to make a matrix organization work. And they had allowed some of those characteristics to atrophy over time. And I don't know if General Hess, who's the expert on this, wants to comment on it.
So the goal would be to develop a system where communication is encouraged rather than discouraged. And from what you're saying, it sounds like perhaps it wasn't discouraged, but people feared.
They did. They did, and we think that our fix about having this independent technical review authority, which owns all the specifications and requirements, which would be full of engineers and safety people who have no relationship to cost and schedule or the program, would be free to discuss all of these things because they wouldn't be intimidated by the guy who's worried about cost and schedule.
Lastly,
as a matter of fact, their reward system would be based upon bringing problems up. That's how they get rewarded.
Lastly, I want to go to the section commitment to a safety culture, and the last line in that, organizations that successfully deal with high-risk technologies create and sustain a disciplined safety system capable of identifying, analyzing, and controlling hazards throughout a technology's life cycle. Obviously, that system was not in place. How do you accomplish that? Because that has to be the number one goal, that whatever is developed will last throughout a technology's life cycle.
I think that the answer to that question also rests in our that is their job. Yes, I'll be closer.
Thanks.
The technical authority, that's going to be their role in life, is to bring that life cycle and systems analysis look into the technology that's involved. The second part of it, obviously, in this chapter, we talk a great deal about the information systems that are there that are supposed to be tracking anomalies and giving trend information, and the fact that they really don't. So, you know, there is a fix that could happen just in information systems and how you manage the information, but having somebody whose job it is to run risk and do trends and to control the level 1 requirements and the waivers is going to give you that life cycle that we think is so very important.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Proceeding along those lines, because of the many important recommendations that you've made, two of the most important are, one, establish an independent technical engineering authority and have that funded directly from NASA headquarters so it has no connection to or responsibility for schedule or program cost. And the second one is the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance should be independently resourced. I think those are highlighted recommendations, and we've got to follow through, and so is NASA. Mr. Feeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Admiral Gaiman and your entire commission. I've haven't thoroughly read from cover to cover the report yet, but my office staff has several times, and we're going to continue to pay attention to it. I'm impressed by the entire approach you've taken. I want to thank you particularly for being accessible. I got a briefing just before our break personally from Admiral Gaiman. I thank you for that, for the time we spent together at the hangar where we were putting together the shuttle, and several other members of the board were there. It was certainly a quite moving experience. And I will tell you that, part of the appreciation for the way you've memorialized the astronauts that have passed away in human flight is in the emblem that you put on the back here. And we're not just talking about the most recent disaster. You include discussions about Apollo 1, the Challenger, and Columbia as well. And, of course, the Latin phrase there, my Latin's a little rusty. I got a D in Latin, had to quit the basketball team because of it. And actually, the Latin teacher's wife was the coach of the basketball team. He understood why I had to quit, by the way. But to the stars, despite adversity, always explore. I think that that's the mission that I believe in, and that basically was the fundamental mission of your report. I want to pick up where Congressman Bell left off, talking about the culture of safety, because it's sort of an amorphous concept to some of us. It's not a technical issue, it's not a precise issue, but it's a culture issue that's very important. And as a lawyer by background, I understand burdens of proof, and I'd like you at one point to describe for me the difference between a culture of safety where you presume that everything's okay unless you know otherwise, as opposed to a culture that basically tells you that nothing's right unless you can prove that it's functioning. And I want to ask you, as you go through that sort of switch and say a burden of proof approach, which is something that I can understand, to talk a little bit about NASA's history. NASA originally approached the board in its initial briefings and espoused their confidence that they had developed a culture of safety and were surrounded by that culture. And yet upon investigation, this board found that simply wasn't accurate. In the aftermath of Challenger, there were some interesting differences between the approach that NASA took and the lessons it learned and the way it trained its inspectors and the way it dealt with a response to the disaster, and say the Navy took. The Navy, for example, developed the SAFER program, the Naval Reactor Program. They trained some 5,000 Navy nuclear propulsion program personnel on the lessons specifically learned from Challenger. And yet it seems like all too quickly NASA, for a variety of reasons, fell right back into some of the same habits. And so I guess I would like you to tell me, number one, whether NASA has understands and how they're going to implement this shift in burden of proof. Number two, how they reacted to the lessons of the Challenger disaster. And number three, in a more generic sense, this isn't the only near disaster we've had. We had the Apollo 12 issue. We had the fuel cell explosion on Apollo 13. We've had launch pad aborts on shuttles involving non-personnel craft. We've got the commercial problems we have from time to time, the military launches. How are we on a routine basis going to learn from all of the, not only disasters with people involved, but also the near disasters or situations where people are not involved? And with that sort of open-ended question, Admiral Gaiman, if you'll refer the answer to the appropriate people or pick it up.
Mr. Feeney, first of all, I'll say something about the culture of safety and something about learning, and then turn it over to my colleagues here who studied this more closely than I did. I was quite confident and quite firm in my deliberations with my colleagues about hammering this subject fairly strongly because of the way we defined culture. We were very careful in our report to make sure that for our readers that we didn't confuse management and we didn't confuse leadership with culture. Culture is what you do rather than what you say. For example, if you say that safety is the most important thing we do, and nothing we do is going to compromise safety, but I want you to come up here to Washington, D.C. every 30 days and give me a brief on how you're doing on making the Node 2 complete schedule, that's doing one thing and saying another. And that, of course, trickles down to the workforce. I mean, that word gets out as to what's important. We studied
By the way, if I can, Admiral, just interrupt briefly, but you have a wonderful definition of culture. It's not like people to read the report on page 101, it's very specific, and then later throughout the report, but especially 177, you talk about the organizational and cultural problems that exist in NASA today. So you do a great job in the report.
Yeah, we knew that there would be some misconstruing and blurring of what the terms meant, so we were careful to define them. We also found, if we go back to that list that General Hess was referring to earlier, we tried to put a recipe in there for what we considered to be the characteristics of a high reliability organization, which we would certainly hope that NASA would be a high reliability organization. And one of the characteristics is that the organization is a learning organization. And by that, they not only learn from big disasters, but they learn from the little things. And just as you point out, in the organizations which we consider to be high reliability organizations, they teach their people from big disasters and little disasters. And they like to keep bringing up 3 Mile Island, and they keep bringing up the Challenger, and they keep bringing up the loss of the submarine Thresher, and they keep bringing these things up to see what we can learn from them. NASA tends not to do that. And they tend not to do that, at least our interviews and our experience was, they tend not to do that because for some reason they've gotten the idea that by bringing up all these failures or near misses, that somehow they are tarnishing the image of the employees or they are diminishing the impression that they're all perfect. And that, of course, is wrong-headed. And therefore, we determined, and we wrote in our report, that NASA is essentially not a learning organization, and they do not learn from these mistakes. And, of course, that's a very serious problem. General Hess, you want to make any further comment on that?
No, sir. The point that I would add in the overall construct of how they approach this cultural dynamic that we're trying to get at is just exactly the issue of absent rules. They're going to react and respond in a way that's dedicated to performing the mission reliably. Okay, and in almost any check and balance that we talk about inside the program, these attributes can be enhanced just by some of the organizational changes that are there. But organization alone is not going to fix the problem. You're going to have to lead your way through it. You're going to have to get managers to understand and buy into this at all levels so that it becomes the way that the organization responds in times of crisis and in times of planning as well.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and allow me to thank the chairman and the ranking member, the full committee, and as well the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee for what will be, I think, a very effective line of hearings that we will have, and as well an ability to be able to follow this line of reasoning that has been so ably played out for us by this very strong report. Might I say to the board, thank you also for your good work. And as I begin my remarks, allow me to put this in the focus that I can recollect was the experience on that fateful day, February 1st, and that is that this whole debate is on the question of lives as well as the mission and vision of this nation on behalf of the American people. So I'd like to note that what we do today is in tribute to and reflection of the sacrifice that Rick D. Husband made, William C. McCool, Michael P. Anderson, David M. Brown, Kapana Chawla, Laurel Blair Salton Clark, and Eliane Ramon. Clearly, I think this is a major tribute, if you will, or a need for a major tribute to their lives, that we not allow what has occurred to be repetitious. I do want to also say to the board that this is in no way a cover-up, and we thank you for your forthrightness and your instructiveness. I will say again, referring back to February 1st, that since it was post 9/11, you can imagine the various thoughts that occurred. So it was even larger than maybe incidents of the past, though we do not diminish any of the incidences of the past. You have spoken about the question of a culture of safety, and I want to refer to some of the language that you use in the report. The board found that there is a broken safety culture. You also mentioned that schedule pressure related to the construction of the International Space Station, budget constraints, and workforce reductions also were factors in the question of what caused the Columbia accident. One of the initiatives that I'm going to propose would be enhanced whistleblower legislation specifically for NASA personnel, because I think that the comment that the ranking member made at the very beginning is so potent, and that is what happened after Challenger, and the emotions and the interest and the commitment seemed to peter out. I'm holding in my hands a series of hearings over 1997, 96, 99, where we discussed the question of safety over and over again. And I would refer you to some words that I offered in 1996, so that there is no mistake. I do have questions and concerns regarding some of the issues involving NASA, the personnel reductions which continue to take place, and the safety of the space shuttle. It was in 1996, March 28th. In September 23rd, 1999, we want NASA to provide safe vehicles for our brave astronauts, yet it would be inane of us to demand a strong space shuttle safety policy when we're cutting the very resources that would fund this policy. Now, you have already shied away somewhat from numbers, but allow me to ask these questions on the safety element, and I applaud this freestanding organizational structure that deals with safety and oversight from NASA headquarters. I want you to comment on the responsibility of NASA headquarters, aside from directly the administrator as it relates to your report. I'd like you also to explore the idea of holding managers accountable for errors, because when we talk about the safety culture, how do we break that line of reasoning? And you might add your thoughts about whistleblower protection overall. You haven't seen the legislation, so I'd imagine you couldn't comment on that. And finally, Admiral, would you put yourself, and others that might want to comment, would you put yourself, Admiral, in the position of being an admiral and finding or having an incident such as this occurring under the military structure? What would be your reaction or your actions as relates to personnel who were directly associated with the responsibility of ignoring information that came directly to them that questioned whether or not there was a sense of safety? My last point is for Dr. Winnall, because I was fascinated by your comments with respect to education. How do we retain the bright and the best as we have moved toward outsourcing over the last decade? I remember growing up looking to those bright folk at NASA, and you admire them and wanted to be like them. How do you solve that problem? And I thank you very much for your presence here today.
The gentle ladies from Texas, time has expired in asking the question, but we'll now turn it over to the panel.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson-Lee, and thank you for your support during this during the time of this investigation. We enjoyed talking to you several times about it. The board, while indeed it decided not to make judgments about the responsibility of individuals, the board in no way suggests that our position suggests that individuals should not be held accountable for their actions. They should be held accountable, and they should be held accountable by their appropriate supervisory chain of command. On page 203 of our report, we have a little editorial in there about the role of leaders and the role of managers and their responsibility for setting the conditions for either success or failure. And they are indeed, we do believe that the top level managers are responsible for setting the conditions, and if they set conditions in which free and open communications were stifled, or engineers were intimidated, or safety was shortchanged, then they're responsible for that, and they have to hold responsibility for that.
I believe that we document in our report, and we were pretty careful to do this. I mean, we wanted to be very careful about this, that these bad traits and these ill characteristics that we're all numbering here came about gradually and slowly over a long period of time due to budget constraints, manpower constraints, and lots of other reasons. But these things didn't happen all in 1 year or 1 month, or they happened over a long period of time, and they happened in response to forces both internal and external. I think that we've kind of, it's all there in the report, I think, and I think I kind of agree with your comment that there probably is some account taking that probably needs to be done by the proper authorities. We just didn't feel we were.
Admiral Gaiman, excuse me for interrupting. I would ask everybody to be brief in reacting to Congresswoman
Sure.
Jackson Lee, and we'll try to get one more 5-minute series
Good.
in
before
we.
Maybe I'll let Dr. Widnall respond to the last point.
I pushed the button. I'd like to respond to that question a little more broadly with respect to this question of how do we retain the best and the brightest, because this is the very committee that is charged with that responsibility. I believe the nation has been richly rewarded by the investments that we've made in science and technology, education, and research across a broad range of scientific and engineering disciplines. So it isn't just the question of how we retain these individuals in NASA. I think the question goes much deeper. How do we strengthen our science and education system? How do we encourage young people to pursue professional careers in science and engineering? And how do we utilize their talents once they graduate? I think in order to do that, it really requires a vigorous program of research and technical development across a broad front, and I would certainly include NASA within that. I do think as an aerospace educator that NASA has a built-in advantage with what I view as the innate passion that goes along with the exploration of space, but we really need to pursue these issues across a much wider front.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I'll proceed with my 5 minutes, and let me start out by suggesting that since the successful Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, certainly our country's space program has been an integral part of our excitement as Americans, and certainly a stimulus to more students getting into science and math. I think we've lost some of that. Congress is charged with setting priorities. As some of you may know, I chair the research subcommittee, and we have had testimony in terms suggesting that much of the scientific research could be better accommodated as effectively on unmanned space flight, and some of the research could be accomplished in ground labs. And so not only manned versus unmanned flight, but also should some of this research dollars go into NIH to cure cancer rather than man's exploration of outer space. It would seem to me that we need to analyze the costs and the benefits of this program. And really, as I understand the board, and congratulations for the time that you sacrificed and the effort you made to do this, such a good and thorough job. But your charge really was what went wrong and how do we keep it from going wrong again. But in terms of the cost and benefits, how do these compare with that of unmanned space flight or other science research that we might conduct? And did the board look at these issues?
We did not, Mr. Smith. What we attempted to do to help you with that question was to properly characterize the risk and properly characterize the cost of the shuttle program, and we did not look into those other issues. And I'm going to have to defer on that. I don't have any knowledge of the value, the cost value of it.
Well, as I talk to other scientific groups, including JPL, we don't have a good quantitative evaluation of the science research. Some have suggested, well, once we give the space station up and running and get it fully manned, maybe we can do some really constructive research. But it would be my opinion, and for any board member that, for any of the witnesses that would like to comment, that manned space flight can contribute a great deal to the additional information of how humans acclimate themselves in outer space, and maybe part of that is do we intend to put people of this country into outer space for longer periods of time? We've been in this endeavor for quite a while, and with the new technology of not only robotics but of nanotechnology and miniaturization, tremendous potential for unmanned spaceflight. It seems to me. Would there be any comment from the witnesses?
We did not evaluate that, but if anybody wants to comment, help themselves. We did not look into that.
How might we best, I think it's exciting to have high school students put in research projects, but in terms of real valuable scientific research, it's probably not substantial in contributing to our research efforts. We're now reducing funding for NIH to develop better research on health. We're now reducing research dollars for the National Science Foundation, which I oversee in our research subcommittee, in terms of basic or fundamental research. So a tremendous challenge, I think, for this committee and this Congress as we evaluate how quickly do we want to push the program. And maybe a comment that you might react to is NASA projected the March launch before you came out with your final report. It seems like this is pushing more rapidly than NASA's ability to totally react to some of the recommendations in your report. Admiral Gaiman.
Yes, sir. I believe Mr. O'Keefe and I are going to have opportunity to appear beside each other next week before your committee. But yesterday, before the Senate, he reiterated an answer to that question several times, in which he said that NASA's return to flight plans are events-driven, not calendar-driven, and that date out there is just a hypothetical mark on the wall. It's not a firm date. I'll let him answer that question.
Well, and I just say to Dr. Halleck and General Hess and Dr. Winhall that part of my bias, which I've expressed in my statement, which without objection will be entered into the record, is my son and daughter both worked at JPL, and so they led me down the road of the kind of information of how valuable unmanned spaceflight was, and the reductions of budget that limits a tremendous potential.
We're going to have a series of votes all day, unfortunately. But let me while we're waiting for Mr. Nethercutt, you're here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Admiral, I appreciate all the work you and the board have done. I think you've done a